A group of astronaut explorers sets out on a 6-month mission called the Aurora Mars Mission 2. In this mission, 8 crew members are deployed on Mars to research any signs of life forms on the planet. The spacecraft Aurora will be sent on Mars to pick them up at the end of their mission. At present, the astronaut explorers are staying in their main outpost known as the Tantalus base and are only 19 hours away from completing their research mission. One day, a strong sandstorm hits towards the location of their base. 2 of the crew members, Vincent Campbell and Rebecca Lane, board one of their rovers and drive through the sandstorm to pick up another crewmate named Kim Aldrich. Kim is still in the middle of drilling the terrain when the 2 astronauts arrive. Vincent calls her attention, but Kim ignores him, continuing with her research on the drilled terrain. So Rebecca and Vincent talk inside the rover while waiting for Kim to finish. Vincent thinks the whole trip back home will be tiresome, taking them another 6 months commuting. Rebecca, on the other hand, is looking forward to finishing their mission, expressing the thought of seeing blue skies and green grass to Vincent when they get back on Earth. Shortly after, they get back to Kim and urges her to come back, reminding her that the mission commander, Charles Brunel, requires everyone's presence inside the base for a briefing on her last day. Kim is forced to board the rover and expresses her frustration on their way back to the Tantalus base. She continuously rants at the outcome of their expedition, thinking they might go home empty-handed. Kim tells the 2 that 6 months is not enough time to discover life forms and that they are just making it easy for the next crew, who will gain the credit. Vincent cuts her off before she can continue and drives the rover back to the base. Back in the base, the remaining crew members are on standby for their last briefing. Commander Charles is monitoring the status of the spacecraft Aurora along with the crew members, Richard Harrington, Robert Irwin, and Lauren Dalby. Richard takes charge of the computer, bringing back their signal as he reports to the control center on Earth about a power outage due to the storm. Inside a laboratory, scientist Marko Petrovic is working on his own research when he discovers a sign of bacterial activity that points to a life form on Mars. He keeps it a secret from the crew, aiming to take the credit for himself. Marko asks permission from their commander Charles to secretly check out his discovery, saying that he will only go out to fix a broken sensor. He is able to convince Charles and soon heads out to his research site to collect further samples while Richard drives him to the area using their rover. Just as Marko and Richard are suiting up to leave the Tantalus base, the 2 come across Vincent, Kim, and Rebecca, who are just returning. Kim watches as the 2 astronauts leave, making her pissed because they are permitted to go out again. Inside an electrical room, Vincent manually repairs the outlets with the company of Robert. Robert gives him coffee while they shortly talk about the spacecraft Aurora. Vincent relays the same worry to Robert about the Aurora, telling him about the 6 months that it would take to get back on Earth. Later, the 2 join Rebecca inside the base's common room as they watch a muffled argument between Kim and Charles. Kim complains to Charles for letting Marko go out on their last day before she enters Marko's workstation. Lauren follows Kim inside the laboratory, warning her that she can't go through his private log. Rebecca, Robert, and Vincent enter with her. Kim doubts Marko's agenda outside, claiming that he does not care about a broken sensor. Just then, Lauren calls in their commander Charles to report Kim's behavior as everyone gathers inside the laboratory. Kim accesses Marko's computer to confirm her hunch, where everyone in the crew finds out about his finding on the bacterial life form. Learning his intention, the crew leaves the laboratory while talking about Marko's discovery. Charles concludes that Marko's assigned research site should be locked down while they send the data to their control center. Laura suggests that they should speak to Marko first because it's his find. Outside, Marko hints Richard about the microscopic anomaly he discovered, telling him to prepare their sample boxes. Richard warns him about their real agenda being unauthorized by their commander, but Marko dismisses him and gains his trust. He then alights from the rover to collect the samples from the research site and successfully confirms a life form on Mars, making him mutter in Serbian, his native language. Just then, he and Richard receive a message from Charles, saying that the site is off limits and that they should leave. Richard warns Marko, but he disobeys the order and holds onto his retrieved sample, staring at it in fascination. Shortly after, a loud cracking breaks on the site as a ground fissure develops around Marko. He calls for Richard's help but ends up falling on a large opening. Richard rushes near the fissure in panic, thinking that Marko could be dead from getting his spacesuit broken. He immediately reports to the base, and soon another rover arrives at the scene, carrying Charles and Lauren. Later, Charles and Richard come back to the Tantalus base to report to the control center before recovering Marko's body. Lauren volunteers to stay inside a rover on the site and watch over Marko, waiting for the rescue crew to arrive. Worried for Marko, she again peeks through the fissure to check on him. She watches as the fissure continues to blow out steam, making her cry in sadness. Lauren goes back in the rover when she hears a faint sound nearby. At the moment, Charles communicates with Lauren, informing her of their status, but her signal malfunctions. Lauren is distracted by the faint sound and decides to check it out, ignoring the signal. When Charles and Richard return to the base, everyone is saddened by Marco's accident. On the other hand, Kim asks Charles when they are planning on announcing the discovery, seemingly excited. Her remark upsets the crew, especially Richard, and they confront her for caring more about the discovery than human decency for Marco. Later, they receive an update from the control center, giving them a go signal to retrieve the body of Marco. Charles, Vincent, Robert, and Rebecca then go back to the site while Kim stays with Richard inside the base. Later, they arrive with the gear and realize that Lauren is nowhere to be found. Charles permits Vincent to go into the fissure, thinking that they'll find both Marco and Lauren. As Vincent slowly enters, he discovers something alive growing on the rock formations. All of a sudden, his breathing quickens as he suffers from a migraine that gives him subtle visions. Vincent manages to see through the bottom of the fissure before he is pulled up by Charles and Rebecca. He informs Charles that the fissure is empty, leaving the rescue crew confused. At that instant, Robert reports about 2 pairs of footprints spotted on the sandy ground. He finds that the footprints are headed back towards the base. Charles reevaluates the situation, sensing something unusual. He instructs the crew to call Kim, telling her to prepare first aid for the casualties. Back in the base, Kim approaches Richard and apologizes for how she acted earlier. In turn, Richard dismisses her and tells her to forget about it. After preparing the first aid equipment, their signal detects the presence of Marco and Lauren, who are approaching the base. Kim finds it odd that they chose to walk back all the way to the base. Nonetheless, Richard is more relieved and does not seem to care. In an instant, he walks towards the airlock to meet the two. Marco staggers as he enters the Tantalus base and falls on the ground. While Richard assists him in removing his helmet, he gasps in surprise at Marco's appearance. His exposure to the bacterial life form has transformed him into an intelligent and hostile zombie-like creature with blackened skin. Marco grabs a power drill nearby and mercilessly stabs Richard in the abdomen. Richard manages to activate the emergency alarm and notify Kim. She goes to the airlock and finds Marco, followed by a zombie-looking Lauren who has just entered the base. Richard instructs Kim to run as the 2 zombies chase after her. Kim heads to the laboratory, locking herself in to evade Marco, but Lauren corners her inside. Marco walks away while a fight ensues between Lauren and Kim. During the struggle, the two end up destroying their laboratory glassware, causing liquids to spill on the floor. Lauren is distracted by the spilled liquid. She sniffs and slurps the liquid on the floor, giving Kim enough time to escape from the laboratory and lock her away. Kim watches as Lauren suddenly screams after seeing her appearance in a mirror. On the other side of the base, Richard is heavily injured. He slowly crawls towards the control system to report the situation to the rescue crew outside. However, he barely relays the message as he collapses on the ground and dies. After some time, the rest of the crew returns to the base with caution. Vincent volunteers to enter the base with Charles, but Charles orders him to stay outside. As Charles goes inside the base, he finds Kim asking her about the situation. Just then, the zombie-looking Marco reappears with an axe and actively pursues them. Charles holds him off while Kim grabs a spacesuit to wear for protection. She then passes through the airlock and gets out of the base. Charles escapes from Marco, but Marco injures him during the process. Vincent, Rebecca, and Robert assist Charles and quickly seals his tiered spacesuit. The crew retreats in their hydroponic dome, a smaller base where they can grow plants without soil. They lay Charles on the table and check his injury while Rebecca injects him with morphine. Kim observes the wound, saying that Charles is not bleeding like usual. Slowly, Charles displays unusual behavior in front of the crew. He experiences memory loss and is suddenly thirsty. But when Robert gives him water, he becomes hostile and strangles him. In response, the crew pulls Robert away from Charles. Vincent tries to calm Charles, and just before his last breath, Charles tells the crew that they will never see home. Charles' last words confuse the crew and make them panic. Robert weeps, expressing how much he wants to go home. In the meantime, Kim straps Charles' body against the table to keep him contained. The crew slowly learns that thirst, memory loss, and hostility are symptoms of infection before transforming to zombie-like creatures. Meanwhile, the infected crew members are out of the main base using the explosives inside. As they are on the loose, Marco quickly reaches the crew in the dome and attempts to break in. Rebecca and Robert see Marco for the first time through the glass window, in shock at his zombie-like appearance. With the main base destroyed, the surviving crew members are unable to contact the Aurora spacecraft. As a result, they devise a plan to fix their communication system and get help. Vincent, being the only member left who can fix the communication system, volunteers to go back to their main base. Rebecca accompanies him, helping Vincent sneak into the main base using the underground pipe. He successfully emerges from the pipe, slowly walking to the control room. At the same time, Rebecca, Kim, and Robert study the bacteria that infected Charles. They find different types of antibiotics stored inside the hydroponic dome and discover that the antibiotics can delay the infection. While in the middle of contacting the Aurora spacecraft, the power suddenly goes off inside the Tantalus base. Vincent heads to the electrical room to fix the power supply. There, he finds Richard disabling the wires already mutated into a zombie-like creature. Upon seeing Vincent, Richard aggressively attacks him. He growls while trying to tear Vincent's spacesuit. Vincent hits him repeatedly, but to no avail. He decides to run back to the pipe and retreat to the hydroponic dome, with Richard chasing after him. Vincent fails to seal the pipe, causing Richard to reach the hydroponic dome. Rebecca and Vincent then run to the main door of the dome while Kim splashes antibiotics on Richard's face. In turn, Richard attacks Kim and she fights back. From the corner of the room, Robert freezes in his spot while watching Richard and Kim fight each other. After much struggle, Kim breaks free from Richard and is close to the door. However, fearing for the infection, Robert escapes the room on his own and deliberately locks the door, leaving Kim to die with the zombies. Vincent, Rebecca, and Robert hurriedly run to the nearby rover since both bases are compromised by their zombie crewmates. They stumble across zombie Lauren, who is carrying a scissor and stabs Rebecca on the leg. Nonetheless, the three of them successfully ride the rover and flee from the base. The three remaining crew members decide to go to the landing site and wait for the arrival of Aurora spacecraft. Robert drives the rover while Vincent tends to Rebecca's injury. Rebecca watches Vincent, saying that there is no point in treating her because she could be already infected. Vincent relieves Rebecca's anxiety, telling her that the first aid may give her body the chance to prevent and fight the infection. After a while, the rover's power runs down due to its low battery. Robert then suggests that they go to the landing site on foot, but Vincent opposes him, implying that Rebecca is injured and cannot walk properly. In turn, Robert subtly persuades Vincent to abandon Rebecca, claiming that she is already infected. Rebecca argues against Robert, suspecting that he could be infected too when Charles previously strangled him. He dismisses her and instead suggests another option, telling them that they can still use the other rover left on Marco's assigned research site. Eventually, the three settle on going to the site to ride the second rover. When they reach the site, Robert offers to pick the vehicle up himself. He wears his suit and slowly approaches the second rover. As soon as Robert powers it up, he again persuades Vincent to abandon Rebecca and leave with him. Vincent firmly disapproves, causing Robert to steal the second rover and flee to the landing site alone. Inside the second rover, Robert removes his headgear, revealing that he has concealed proof of his possible infection. At the same time, their infected crew members have begun to follow their tracks. Using the remaining battery of the rover, Rebecca and Vincent drive towards the sandstorm to hide their tracks from the zombies. They spend the night through the storm and wait for the sun to rise, which will recharge the solar-powered batteries of the rover. Gradually, Rebecca's symptoms show up as she becomes thirsty, requesting water from Vincent. The two notice this, but do not talk about it. Later, Rebecca opens up about their commander, Charles. She talks about how she could see him fight the infection, wondering if he is still alive. Reneka continues, expressing her worry for the future and asks Vincent questions about death. Unable to give her answers, Vincent holds her hand to ease her worries. Afterwards, Vincent falls asleep and wakes up as the sun's rays hit his face. He receives a late message from the crew of the Aurora spacecraft, stating that they will send in an emergency team if anyone responds to them. Vincent attempts to contact the Aurora, but the other line has no response. He looks for Rebecca and realizes that she is no longer in the rover. Vincent drives the rover and follows her footprints, where he finds her fleeing away from him. From a distance, he goes after Rebecca and calls her using their wireless communication device. He persuades her to come back to the rover, but Rebecca insists on staying away from Vincent, knowing that soon she is likely to transform into a zombie-like creature. Vincent promises her that they will find a way to cure her infection. When Rebecca ignores him, he steps out of the rover to run after her. Before Vincent could approach her, Rebecca decides to remove her safety helmet. The planet's atmosphere suffocates her, leading to her immediate death. While Vincent sobs at Rebecca's death, the infection takes over her body. She awakens before Vincent, transformed as a zombie-like creature, and attacks him. Rebecca cries while trying to fight off the infection, telling Vincent to kill her. He sobs continuously, left with no choice but to kill her by slamming a rock on her head. Right then, the Aurora spacecraft arrives on its landing site. Vincent and Robert separately make their way to the Aurora, wherein he approaches on foot while Robert uses the second rover. Vincent notices Kim and his other infected crewmates also nearing the spacecraft. He tries to warn Robert and the Aurora crew, but fails for his broken communication device. When he reaches the spacecraft, Vincent witnesses that all the Aurora crew members who had exited the spacecraft are already dead, and Kim is feeding off one of them. Eventually, Vincent reaches the spacecraft and makes it inside. He slowly walks to the pilot's seat, finding Robert inside noticeably infected by the bacteria. Even so, Robert is seated on the spacecraft with a small knife shoved into his hand. Robert mumbles, exclaiming how he can't feel his own hands and wants to feel again. He also tells Vincent that he no longer remembers the name of her daughter when he was hoping to say goodbye. Vincent helps him recall, saying that her name is Ella. However, he insists that he cannot let Robert set foot on Earth because it will be dangerous for everybody. Robert ignores him and initiates the launch of the Aurora. After powering up the engines, he proceeds on to attack Vincent. A fight ensues between Robert and Vincent inside the Aurora spacecraft. While Vincent is cornered on the wall, he punches Robert and kicks him away. Robert uses the small knife on his hand to stab through Vincent's safety helmet. Vincent gets a tiny cut on his cheek, while Robert gets back on the pilot's seat to navigate the spacecraft. Vincent groans as the Aurora takes off, moving towards Robert to stab him with a small knife. However, Robert counters his attack and pushes him away. During the struggle, they accidentally activate the knob that accelerates the engines, causing the Aurora to advance faster. The two fight, tossing and turning around inside the ship until Vincent kills Robert. When they reach into the orbit, Vincent notices Robert's bacterial blood droplets floating around the Aurora. He then checks on his suit, seeing that the safety helmet is broken. Vincent discards Robert's body in space, along with the remaining blood droplets. Inside the Aurora, he quietly settles down and treats his tiny cut with an antibiotic. Vincent relays a message for the control center, updating them about his status. He reports that the entire crew of Tantalus base has been infected by a virulent bacteria, and he has insufficient fuel to meet them enough supplies in the ship in case they will rescue him. However, due to his tiny cut, Vincent admits that he might also be infected and does not recommend the rescue. Ultimately, he ends the report and awaits their reply while the Aurora floats in space.